Welcome back to Arkansas, where we try to make sense of the issues affecting Arkansans, and today we're starting our series on the 2022 ballot issues, the laws that you get to vote on this November. This year there are 4 of them, and all 4 are constitutional amendments. The Arkansas legislature isn't allowed to pass constitutional amendments on its own. Arkansas voters have the final say. Every election cycle, the legislature can send up to 3 amendments to the ballot, and they frequently do. This year, issues 1, 2, and 3 are all legislatively referred constitutional amendments. Meanwhile, issue 4 is a constitutional amendment that reached the ballot through a citizens initiative, a petition drive to get the signatures of registered voters who all say they wanted to see issue 4 on the ballot. So let's start at the beginning. Issue 1, a constitutional amendment to allow the General Assembly to convene an extraordinary session. Every even-numbered year, in November, we get to vote for some of our legislators in the Arkansas House and Senate. 2 months later, January of every odd-numbered year, all the state legislators meet for what's called their regular session. A regular session, by default, lasts 60 days. The legislature can add an extra 15 days with a 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate, and with a 3/4 vote, they can add even more time, with no absolute limit. This once every 2 years regular session used to be the only scheduled meeting of the full Arkansas legislature. But in 2008, voters approved an amendment which added the fiscal session. That session meets in the even-numbered years, in between regular sessions, and is primarily about appropriation bills that have to do with spending state money. During a fiscal session, legislators can only propose something not related to the budget if both the House and Senate vote with a 2/3 majority to consider it. Fiscal sessions also have a much stricter time limit than regular sessions. A fiscal session, by default, lasts just 30 days. While that can be extended by 15 days, it cannot last longer than 45 days total. But while the regular and fiscal sessions are the only scheduled meetings of the legislature, there's also another instance under which they can meet. The state constitution allows for what's called an extraordinary or special session. Under the current laws, the only person with the power to call a special session is the governor. Quoting the Arkansas Constitution, Article 6, Section 19, quote, "The governor may, by proclamation on extraordinary occasions, convene the General Assembly, and he shall specify in his proclamation the purpose for which they are convened, and no other business than that set forth therein shall be transacted until the same shall have been disposed of, after which they may, by a vote of 2/3, remain in session not exceeding 15 days, unquote. 2 important things to note. 1, although the law says the governor can call a special session on extraordinary occasions, it doesn't specify what qualifies as extraordinary. And as a result, special sessions are called pretty regularly, an average of about once a year. Second, special sessions don't have a limit on the number of days they can last. Instead, when the governor calls for a special session, they have to include a list of specific proposals to be considered during that session. From the time the session starts, the legislature can only work on the things on that list until everything on the list has been dealt with in some way. Once that's done, either the session ends or the legislature can vote to extend the session for 15 days, during which they can propose things not related to the initial list. But that's a pretty tight window. Legislation normally takes months to pass, so it's hard to do much in that time. For an example of what this looks like, here is the governor's proclamation from August of 2022 calling for a special session. In it, he lists 4 specific proposals. Those were the only things that could be considered during the session. Once all of those proposals had been dealt with in some way, a vote was taken to end the session, and it passed. So that's how things are now, but here's how they would change if Issue 1 passes. Issue 1 would make it so that the legislature can call a special session all on its own. It could do this in one of 2 ways. Either at least 2/3 of the members of both the House and Senate would have to sign a statement calling for one, or the highest-ranking member from the House and Senate would have to issue a joint proclamation saying, "We call a special session." Either way, the call for the special session has to include a specific set of things that will be discussed during that session, just like when the governor calls one. While Issue 1 sets out the basic rules on how the special session would work, it purposely leaves out some of the details. In Section E3, it says that the legislature will be allowed to set up those details and change them in the future during a regular legislative session. It also gives 3 examples of rules they may include. First, a limit on the duration of the session. Second, the format of their proclamation calling for the session. And third, an option to extend the session by 15 days if 2/3 of the House and Senate vote for it, just like when the governor calls one. Again, all 3 of these are rules the legislature, quote, may include without restrictions. Because the language is may include rather than shall include, it means the legislature also has the option to not include them. Finally, Issue 1 ends by clarifying that this new power would not restrict the governor's ability to call a special session on their own. So now you know what Issue 1 would do. But why did Issue 1 end up on our ballot in the first place? Well, Arkansas has a history of having a very weak governor, which starts with our Constitution. The Arkansas state constitution we operate under today was written in 1874, just after former Confederates were given the right to vote again. So the people elected to the Constitutional Convention were, generally, not too happy with the pro-union governor and legislature who had gained control during Reconstruction. In turn, the 1874 Constitution limits the powers of the governor and legislature severely, and many of those limitations still exist today. That includes the rule limiting regular legislative sessions to 60 days every other year. It includes the legislature's power to override the governor's veto with a simple majority. It even includes the requirement that state constitutional amendments authored by the legislature have to be sent to the people and limits them to 3 per voting year, which is how Issues 1, 2, and 3 ended up on your ballot. Those limitations mean that if the Arkansas legislature wants to expand its power, the only way to do so is by putting amendments like Issue 1 on our ballots. And they've had some success with that, like adding the fiscal session. But the governor doesn't have a way to propose amendments other than working with the legislature, so the governor's powers haven't expanded as much. But 2 powers the governor does have are the powers to declare emergencies and to make executive orders. And if those happen when the legislature isn't in session, there's not much legislators can do about it, which is exactly what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. In mid-2020, responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Hutchinson declared a state of emergency and issued a number of restrictions based on guidelines from the Arkansas Department of Health. While those restrictions were generally less limiting than the national average, they still went farther than many members of the Arkansas legislature wanted. Had the legislature been in session, they might have been able to counter the governor's actions in some way, but without any means to call themselves into session, they couldn't respond until the next regular session in January of 2021. And it was during that session when legislators passed multiple laws attempting to overturn some of the governor's actions or to make sure the same things couldn't happen again. That includes a bill giving the legislature the power to end a governor-declared state of emergency anytime they are in session. And that January session was also when the legislature voted to put Issue 1 on our ballot. The implication is clear. State legislators didn't like their inability to change policy during the pandemic and want to be able to call themselves into session in the future if something like that happens again, and any other time they like too. And Arkansas isn't the only state where this is happening. In both Kentucky and Idaho, the legislature disapproved of restrictions the governor placed on their state during the pandemic, and in turn have referred an amendment to voters which would allow those state legislatures to call themselves into session. Now that you know what Issue 1 would do and how it got on the ballot, let's talk about some of the arguments in favor of it. There are 2 primary arguments in favor of Issue 1. The first is that the legislature should be able to call itself into session more often, generally. And the second is that the legislature should specifically be able to call itself into session when it feels like the governor is overstepping their boundaries. A legislative body being able to call itself into a special session of some kind is relatively normal. As of right now, 36 states have some procedure by which the legislature can call itself into special session, with various restrictions on how often they can do that and how long those sessions can take. Arkansas is one of only 14 states where the power to call a special session rests solely with the governor. There's also a lot of variation within different states on how often regular sessions can happen and how long they can be. For comparison, let's look at Kansas, Mississippi, Nevada, and Iowa, since they're the 4 states with a population closest to Arkansas, so their legislators might expect to deal with about the same amount of business. Each of those states has an upper limit on how long their legislatures can meet. The Kansas legislature meets for a maximum of 90 days, and only in even years. Mississippi is 90 days every year, plus an extra 35 days in years when a governor is elected. Nevada meets up to 120 days every other year, and Iowa meets for a maximum of 110 days in odd years and 100 days in even years. It's also worth noting that of those 4 states, Mississippi is the only one where the legislature can't call itself into special session. So, compared to similarly sized states, Arkansas's legislature has a significantly lower cap on the total number of days it can meet. Folks in favor of Issue 1 might argue that this means the legislature doesn't have enough time to deal with the needs of the people. It might be possible to deal with that by extending the regular sessions, but by doing it through a special session, the legislature would be forced to stick to a specific agenda, which might be more efficient than a general session. Folks in favor of Issue 1 might also argue that if something like the COVID pandemic happens again, the legislature needs to be able to react quickly. By allowing the legislature to call itself into session, Issue 1 would eliminate the need for the governor to act solely through emergency declarations in crisis situations. This would effectively shift some power away from the governor onto the legislature. If you believe that during an emergency, the Arkansas state legislature is likely to make better decisions than the governor is, then you might want that power shift. Finally, remember how the Arkansas state legislature can override a governor's veto with just a simple majority? That low bar means vetoes don't happen often. In his 8 years as governor, Asa Hutchinson has only successfully vetoed 5 full bills. That's fewer vetoes in that time period than almost any other state. That effectively means that most of the bills that the legislature passes become law, and the ability to call more sessions means more laws enacted. So Issue 1 doesn't just shift power away from the governor, but also expands the power of the legislature more broadly. Plus, calling sessions more frequently means laws can change more frequently. Some proponents of Issue 1 would argue that it's a good thing to have a powerful state legislature, able to react quickly to changing situations. So, if you want the legislature to have even more time in session, or if you want the legislature to have more authority in emergencies and the governor to have less, or if you generally think the state legislature needs more power and autonomy, then you will want to vote yes on Issue 1. So now, let's look at some of the arguments against Issue 1. Right now, being a legislator in Arkansas isn't intended to be a full-time job. Legislators are expected to spend less than half of the year working at the Capitol and aren't paid as if they're working full-time. This was written into the state constitution intentionally, with the hope that legislators will spend a significant amount of their time living and working in the places they represent and listening to the concerns of the people there. Some people also believe that a part-time legislature is more likely to spend their limited sessions focused on more important issues. Of all the states in the U.S., only 10 have legislatures that are expected to be full-time jobs, both in hours and pay. Meanwhile, 14 states have legislatures whose hours and pay add up to about half of a full-time job. Arkansas, along with most states, is in between those two. However, Issue 1 would allow the legislature to meet more often, increasing the total number of hours they work each year. Some people against Issue 1 argue that the more time legislators spend in session, the more out of touch they might become with the people they represent. Those legislators might also use this time to focus on legislation that is less important, or even unnecessary. Also, we Arkansans have to pay for those extra legislative sessions. Legislators are paid a yearly salary, and Issue 1 would not increase that. However, they are also paid a daily per diem to cover food and other travel expenses. Each of the 135 legislators receives either $59 a day if they live within 50 miles of the Capitol, or $154 a day if they don't. Legislators are also reimbursed for travel mileage and other expenses, and that all adds up. In 2021, the legislature had 1 full legislative session plus 2 special sessions that lasted 3 days each. The total per diem cost was about $3.1 million, which comes out to about $47,000 per each day they were in session. If Issue 1 passes, each time the legislature called itself into session, they would be paid their daily per diem. And some folks against Issue 1 argue that taxpayers shouldn't have to fund those extra and potentially unnecessary legislative sessions. Another argument against Issue 1 is that it's trying to strengthen an already strong legislature and weaken an already weak governor. As we said before, Issue 1 ended up on the ballot because the legislature was unhappy with what the governor did during COVID. They want to be able to call themselves into session to override executive actions in the future. And as we also mentioned, the powers of the Arkansas governor are already incredibly weak in many respects. If you remember your basic civics, you know that the federal system has 3 parts: the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. While each branch usually operates under its own rules, there's also a system of checks and balances, ways each branch can keep any other branch from doing anything too wild. State government works much the same way. We have a legislature, a state Supreme Court, and the governor is the head of the executive branch. People in favor of Issue 1 argue that it gives the legislative branch more power to check the governor. But some people against it will point out that checks and balances only work if they can't be used all the time. For example, in our federal government, laws can pass through Congress with just a 50% majority vote. But to override a president's veto, it takes a 2/3 vote. The idea is that the threshold to say no to another branch should be high, so it can't be used all the time. But in Arkansas, legislators can overcome a governor's veto with a simple 50% majority, which means they already have a huge check over the governor. One of the only things keeping the legislature from expanding its power is the limit on their time in session, but Issue 1 would effectively end that limit. So some folks against Issue 1 argue that it further erodes the separation of powers in our state government. Some also argue that it's a bad idea to shift power away from the governor to the legislature, especially one that's so unpopular as of late. The very legislature that sent Issue 1 to our ballot ended their last session with an approval rating of 23%, and for many of those seats, you won't have a choice this November. Every election cycle, a huge number of Arkansas House and Senate seats go unopposed, with only one candidate on the ballot, and this can leave a lot of folks feeling like they have no voice in the legislature. If the people of Arkansas don't feel represented by their legislature, then why would they vote to give them more power? It's also worth pointing out some of the problems that folks have with the language of Issue 1. For starters, it allows a session to be called in one of two ways: a 2/3 vote by both the House and the Senate, or an agreement between the highest-ranking members of both bodies. If we were in a state where the control of the two parts of the legislature was frequently split, then that would be a pretty high threshold to reach. But we aren't. In the last 30 years, the Arkansas House and Arkansas Senate have always been controlled by the same party. And anytime that happens, the chairman of the House and the Speaker pro tem are going to be of the same party and likely to be in agreement. All of that together means that Issue 1's threshold to call a special session is super easy to achieve. So it doesn't create any real limit on how often those sessions could happen. And just like the rules for how the governor calls a special session, Issue 1 says they can be called on extraordinary occasions, but gives no definition for what that is. Issue 1 also leaves a lot of its details to be decided later by the legislature, without input from the voters. Some people against Issue 1 say that the whole point of having to send constitutional amendments to the ballot is so regular Arkansans can read the details and decide for ourselves. But Issue 1 basically says, we grant ourselves the power to call ourselves into session, and we will work out the details later. Some folks oppose Issue 1 for that exact reason. So, if you prefer a part-time legislature and think more sessions could lead to a worse legislature, or if you believe the legislature doesn't need more power or to make the governor any weaker, or if you think the ambiguity of the language of Issue 1 makes it too easy to call a special session, then you'll want to vote no on Issue 1. And that's it. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can subscribe and join us on more explorations of Arkansas politics and history. You can also check out our other videos on voter issues this year. And if you want to help us create more videos like this, consider donating to Arkansans on Patreon. Patreon is the easiest way to support content makers in a way that works for your budget. You decide how much you want to give each month, and you can change that amount at any time. And bigger donations get bigger perks, including a sneak peek at our upcoming documentary about the myths and truths around the reputation of Harrison, Arkansas. And speaking of our patrons, thanks to Zach Green, Tim in Vegas, Alan Archer, Blake Hulse, Jordan Little, Madeline Applegate Gross, and Poetize with Deanna Starshine for making this video happen. Thanks again, and see you next time for more Arkansans.